What becomes truly fascinating is that the deeper scientists explore consciousness, the more they begin to realize that the human mind cannot be separated from the body as easily as we once believed. For generations, the brain was treated like a biological machine, producing thoughts the way a computer produces calculations. But today, many researchers are starting to question whether consciousness is something far more dynamic, interconnected, and influential than we ever imagined. I often think about how strange it is that two people can experience the exact same event and walk away transformed in completely different ways. One person sees challenge and becomes stronger. Another sees the same challenge and collapses under fear. The external experience may be identical, yet the internal interpretation changes everything. That observation alone has led many scientists to investigate the enormous role perception plays in shaping biology. What they are discovering is remarkable. The body does not simply react to physical reality, it reacts to the story we tell ourselves about reality. Our beliefs, expectations, emotional memories, and internal dialogue influence chemical responses inside the body every single moment of our lives. Stress hormones rise not only because danger exists, but because the mind perceives danger. Healing responses increase not only because medicine is taken, but because the nervous system feels safety, hope, and trust. This is where consciousness stops becoming a philosophical curiosity and begins entering measurable science. Researchers studying neuroplasticity discovered that the brain continuously reorganizes itself based on thought, behavior, and emotional repetition. In other words, the brain is not fixed. It adapts to what we repeatedly feel and focus upon. Every repeated emotional state becomes a signal. Every persistent thought becomes instruction. Over time, those instructions become biology. When I reflect on this, I realize how many people unknowingly rehearse emotional patterns for years. Some rehearse fear every morning, others rehearse guilt, anger, or hopelessness. The body eventually memorizes those emotional states so deeply that they begin to feel normal. And once the body becomes conditioned emotionally, changing life externally often changes very little internally. This may explain why people sometimes achieve success yet still feel empty, or why someone can leave a painful relationship but continue recreating the same emotional experience with different people. Consciousness carries patterns forward until awareness interrupts the cycle. Modern imaging technology has allowed scientists to observe how emotional states affect the brain and nervous system in real time. Chronic fear activates survival circuitry. Gratitude and emotional connection activate entirely different neural networks associated with healing, learning, and regulation. Even the immune system appears deeply connected to emotional experience. For centuries, ancient traditions suggested that emotion was energy influencing the entire human system. At the time, such ideas were often dismissed because they could not be measured. But now, modern science is slowly revealing biological pathways that mirror many of those ancient observations. The language may be different, yet the underlying insight feels strangely familiar. Our inner world shapes our outer experience more than we once believed. One reason scientists remain fascinated by consciousness is because it refuses to fit neatly inside conventional models. We can measure electrical activity in the brain, but electrical activity alone does not explain subjective experience. We can observe neurons firing, yet we still cannot fully explain why awareness exists at all. Why do we experience meaning? Why do emotions feel deeply personal? Why does human awareness possess creativity, intuition, imagination, and self-reflection? These questions sit at the edge of neuroscience, psychology, biology, and even physics. And despite extraordinary technological advancement, consciousness remains one of the greatest mysteries humanity has ever encountered. I believe this mystery matters because it changes how we understand ourselves. If consciousness influences biology, perception, behavior, and even human resilience, then our internal state is not something secondary to life. It is central to life. This realization carries practical consequences. For example, many people spend years waiting for external conditions to create internal peace. They believe happiness will arrive after success, after money, after recognition, after certainty. Yet studies repeatedly show that emotional regulation, meaning connection and mental focus, profoundly influence physical health and long-term well-being, regardless of external circumstances. That does not mean thoughts magically control reality in simplistic ways. Human life is far more complex than that. But it does suggest that our relationship with experience changes the way the body processes experience. And that distinction is extremely important When the nervous system lives in constant survival mode, the body pays a price. Sleep suffers, inflammation rises, cognitive clarity declines, emotional reactions intensify. Over time, stress becomes identity. But when awareness interrupts those patterns, the biology can begin shifting in surprisingly measurable ways. Meditation research offers one powerful example. Scientists observing long-term meditation practitioners found changes in attention, emotional regulation, stress response, and even structural aspects of the brain. What fascinates researchers is not merely relaxation itself, but the possibility that intentional awareness can physically reshape neural pathways over time. Think about the implications of that for a moment. If sustained attention changes the brain, then where we place our awareness every day may be one of the most important decisions we ever make. Because attention is not passive. Attention feeds patterns. Attention strengthens circuitry. Attention becomes experience. And perhaps this is why consciousness research continues expanding across so many disciplines. Scientists are beginning to see that consciousness may not simply be a byproduct of life, but an active participant within it. The mind affects the body affects the mind. Emotions affect perception affects behavior, and behavior reinforces emotional identity in an endless feedback loop that most people never fully notice until they begin consciously observing themselves. And once a person truly begins observing themselves closely, something extraordinary starts to happen inside the nervous system, because they begin realizing that many of their automatic reactions were never actually permanent at all, but conditioned responses waiting to be rewritten through awareness, intention, and sustained emotional clarity that slowly transforms the way they experience reality from within. What makes this even more compelling is that scientists are now discovering how deeply the body responds to emotional meaning, not just physical events. Two individuals may face identical circumstances, yet their biological reactions can be completely different depending on interpretation. One person perceives uncertainty as danger, while another perceives it as possibility. That internal difference changes chemistry, neural activity, hormonal balance, and long-term resilience in ways researchers can increasingly observe and measure. I think many people underestimate how much of their daily experience is driven by unconscious conditioning. By adulthood, most reactions happen automatically. The body wakes with familiar emotions, the mind repeats familiar thoughts, and behavior follows familiar patterns. Eventually, personality itself can become a loop of memorized emotional responses. We begin calling it who we are, even though much of it was learned through repetition and environment. This is why consciousness research is so revolutionary. It suggests that awareness gives us the ability to interrupt automatic programming. When a person becomes conscious of their thoughts instead of being controlled by them, something shifts internally. There is suddenly a space between stimulus and reaction. In that space, new choices become possible. And from a scientific perspective, repeated new choices can eventually rewire the brain itself. Researchers studying trauma have observed how powerful emotional experiences become encoded within the nervous system. The body remembers stress long after the event has passed. Muscles tighten automatically. Hormones remain elevated. Hypervigilance becomes normal. In many cases, people are not responding to the present moment at all. They are responding to emotional echoes from the past. But the opposite also appears true. Positive emotional states such as gratitude, compassion, connection, and purpose create measurable physiological effects associated with regulation and healing. The heart rhythm becomes more coherent. Stress responses decrease. Cognitive flexibility improves. Even immune activity appears influenced by emotional condition. What fascinates scientists is not simply that emotions matter, but that the body seems to interpret emotional meaning as biological instruction. This changes the way we think about health entirely. For decades, medicine focused primarily on physical symptoms. And while that approach created extraordinary advancements, consciousness research is expanding the conversation. Many researchers now recognize that emotional states, beliefs, perception, and social connection may play enormous roles in long-term well-being. I find it interesting that ancient cultures often emphasize balance between mind, body, and emotion long before modern technology existed. They observed patterns through direct human experience rather than laboratory instruments. Today, science is approaching similar insights from an entirely different direction. Advanced brain scans, nervous system analysis, and psychophysiological studies are revealing connections that older traditions sensed intuitively. Again, this does not mean every ancient idea was scientifically accurate, but it does suggest humanity may have understood certain aspects of inner experience more deeply than modern society once assumed. Another reason consciousness fascinates scientists is because it challenges material assumptions about identity itself. Most people grow up believing they are merely the sum of physical processes happening inside the brain, yet consciousness introduces questions that remain unresolved. Why are we self-aware? Why can we observe our own thoughts? Why do humans possess imagination powerful enough to mentally simulate realities that do not yet exist? Why can belief alter performance, perception, and even physical endurance? These questions point towards something extraordinary about human awareness. Athletes provide one fascinating example. Studies repeatedly show that visualization activates many of the same neural pathways involved in actual physical performance. In other words, the brain responds to vividly imagined experience in ways surprisingly similar to real experience. Mental rehearsal strengthens physical capability. That finding alone changes how we understand consciousness. It means imagination is not merely fantasy. Under certain conditions, it becomes neurological training. The same principle appears in placebo research, one of the most controversial yet revealing areas of medical science. When people genuinely believe they are receiving effective treatment, measurable physiological improvements sometimes occur, even when the treatment itself contains no active medical ingredient. Scientists continue debating the mechanisms involved, but the implication is undeniable. Belief influences biology. That realization forces us to reconsider the power of expectation. If negative expectation can increase stress and dysfunction, then positive expectation may influence recovery, resilience, and motivation more deeply than we once believed. Consciousness becomes not just an observer of life, but an active participant in shaping human experience. I believe this is why so many researchers remain captivated by the mystery. Consciousness appears to exist at the intersection of biology, psychology, perception, memory, emotion, and identity all at once. It cannot be reduced to a single category because it touches every category. And perhaps even more importantly, consciousness influences how we experience reality itself. Two people may live in the same world but psychologically inhabit completely different realities. One sees limitation everywhere. Another sees opportunity. One becomes trapped in resentment. Another transforms pain into wisdom. The external world matters, of course, but internal interpretation continuously filters experience. This may explain why awareness practices are gaining scientific attention globally. Breathing techniques, mindfulness training, meditation, emotional regulation practices, and intentional focus are increasingly being studied not as abstract philosophy, but as measurable tools affecting human performance and health. Researchers are discovering that attention itself may shape brain organization over time. The repeated focus on fear strengthens fear circuitry. Repeated focus on possibility strengthens different neural patterns. What we repeatedly feel and think becomes familiar to the nervous system, and familiarity eventually becomes identity. That insight carries enormous responsibility. Because if human beings can condition themselves unconsciously through repetition, then they may also consciously reshape aspects of their emotional and mental lives through deliberate awareness. Change may not happen instantly, but the nervous system appears far more adaptable than earlier models suggested. And this is where consciousness research becomes deeply personal for many people, because they begin realizing that transformation is not necessarily about becoming someone entirely different. It may instead involve remembering that beneath years of conditioning, emotional survival patterns, and unconscious habits, there exists an awareness capable of observing, learning, adapting, and slowly creating a new relationship with reality itself, one thought, one emotion, and one conscious moment at a time. The more scientists investigate this possibility, the more they encounter a profound question that reaches beyond biology alone. If awareness can observe our thoughts, then who or what is the observer? This question has become one of the most intriguing frontiers in consciousness research because it challenges the assumption that human identity is fixed entirely within automatic mental activity. Most people spend their lives identified with every thought that enters the mind. If fear appears, they become fear. If anger appears, they become anger. If doubt appears, they believe the doubt completely. Yet consciousness research increasingly suggests that awareness itself may exist separately from the constant stream of mental activity. In practical terms, this means we may have the ability to witness our internal patterns without immediately becoming controlled by them. That distinction changes everything. I have noticed that the moment people begin observing their thoughts instead of automatically obeying them, emotional freedom starts emerging. The mind may still generate fear, frustration, or insecurity, but awareness creates distance from those reactions. That distance interrupts conditioning. And once conditioning is interrupted, new neural pathways become possible. Scientists studying mindfulness and self-awareness practices often describe this process in terms of metacognition, the ability to think about thinking itself. Brain imaging studies show that intentional awareness can influence emotional regulation centers in remarkable ways. Instead of remaining trapped in reactive survival states, individuals gradually strengthen networks associated with reflection, balance, and conscious response. This is important because survival mode changes perception dramatically. When the nervous system believes it is under constant threat, attention narrows, creativity decreases, empathy weakens, the body prioritizes defense over growth. Over time, people stop experiencing life directly and begin experiencing reality through filters of stress and anticipation. They may become physically safe, yet emotionally trapped inside patterns built years earlier. Modern society unintentionally reinforces this condition. Constant stimulation, endless information, comparison, uncertainty, and emotional overload keep many nervous systems locked in chronic activation. The body was never designed to remain in emergency mode continuously, yet millions of people live that way every day without realizing it. This is why scientists are becoming increasingly interested in practices that restore nervous system balance. Breath regulation, focused attention, emotional processing, and meditative states are no longer viewed only as personal wellness habits. Researchers now examine them as measurable physiological interventions capable of affecting stress response, brain activity, inflammation, and cognitive function. Breathing itself offers a fascinating example. For years, breathing was considered largely automatic, something happening in the background of life. But researchers discovered that controlled breathing patterns directly influence the autonomic nervous system. Slow, intentional breathing can shift the body away from stress activation and toward regulation. Heart rhythms change, hormonal responses shift, mental clarity improves. Something as simple as conscious breath begins revealing the profound relationship between awareness and biology. And perhaps this is one reason consciousness fascinates scientists so deeply. The closer they look, the more interconnected everything appears. Thoughts influence emotions, emotions influence hormones, hormones influence perception and behavior, behavior reinforces emotional patterns. The entire human system operates less like isolated parts and more like an integrated network, constantly responding to internal experience. Even language matters more than we once believed. Studies suggest that the words people repeatedly use influence emotional orientation and mental framing. Someone constantly speaking in hopeless terms strengthens internal patterns associated with limitation. Someone practicing constructive emotional language gradually reinforces different neural associations. Again, this does not mean positivity magically solves every challenge. Human suffering is real and complex. But consciousness research indicates that interpretation and internal narrative profoundly affect how people move through difficulty. I often think about how many individuals unconsciously rehearse worst-case scenarios every day. The body responds as though imagined danger is real. Stress chemistry increases even when no immediate threat exists. Over months and years, those patterns accumulate. The nervous system learns anxiety through repetition. But encouragingly, the nervous system also appears capable of learning calm, resilience, and emotional flexibility through repetition. This may explain why consistent practices matter more than occasional motivation. Small daily shifts repeated over time gradually condition the brain and body toward new patterns. Awareness is not built in a single breakthrough moment. It develops through repeated conscious attention. Scientists studying long-term behavioral change often emphasize this exact principle. Lasting transformation rarely comes from force alone. It comes from repetition strong enough to create new neural familiarity. Eventually, what once felt difficult becomes natural because the brain adapts to the new pattern. This understanding changes how we think about personal growth entirely. Instead of seeing ourselves as permanently defined by the past, consciousness research suggests the human system remains adaptable throughout life. The brain can reorganize, emotional responses can evolve, perception can shift. Identity itself may be more flexible than earlier generations believed. At the same time, researchers remain humble about how much remains unknown. Consciousness still cannot be fully explained through current scientific models. We can measure correlates of awareness, observe brain activity, and track physiological responses. Yet the subjective experience of being conscious remains mysterious. Why does awareness exist at all? Why do humans experience meaning, beauty, intuition, love, and inner reflection? Why does consciousness possess the ability to imagine futures that do not yet exist and emotionally respond to those imagined realities as though they are happening now? These questions continue drawing scientists, philosophers, psychologists, and neurologists toward deeper exploration because consciousness appears connected not only to survival, but to the very essence of human experience itself. And perhaps the most transformative realization emerging from this research is the possibility that awareness is not something passive trapped inside the body, but an active force, continuously shaping how we perceive, interpret, and ultimately live our lives moment by moment. Through the invisible relationship between thought, emotion, attention, biology, and the meaning we assign to our experiences every single day. What becomes increasingly clear through all of this research is that human beings are not merely reacting to reality mechanically. We are constantly participating in reality through perception, emotion, expectation, and attention. Scientists studying consciousness are beginning to recognize that the quality of our awareness may influence nearly every dimension of human experience, from physical health to decision-making, relationships, creativity, and resilience. I find this especially important because many people unknowingly live disconnected from their own internal state. They move through life on automatic pilot, repeating emotional routines without ever questioning them. Stress becomes normal. Emotional exhaustion becomes normal. Constant distraction becomes normal. Eventually, silence itself begins to feel uncomfortable because it forces confrontation with the inner world. But consciousness research repeatedly points toward the importance of self-awareness. The ability to observe our inner condition honestly may be one of the most powerful capacities human beings possess. When people slow down enough to become aware of their emotional patterns, they often discover that many reactions were inherited from earlier experiences. Fear may have been learned through instability. Shame may have been reinforced through criticism. Emotional withdrawal may have developed as protection against disappointment. These patterns once served survival, but over time they can quietly shape an entire life. What fascinates researchers is how deeply these emotional imprints affect the nervous system long after the original events disappear. The body continues responding to old emotional memories as though they are happening in the present moment. A tone of voice, a facial expression, or uncertainty about the future can trigger stress responses connected to experiences from years earlier. In many ways, consciousness research is revealing that healing involves more than changing circumstances externally. It involves transforming the relationship between awareness and memory internally. This is why emotional processing has become such an important area of scientific study. Suppressed emotions do not simply vanish because we ignore them. In many cases, they continue influencing physiology beneath conscious awareness. Chronic emotional tension may alter breathing patterns, muscle activity, sleep quality, immune response, and mental focus without people fully realizing the source. Yet researchers are also finding something hopeful. Awareness changes the equation. The moment people consciously acknowledge emotions instead of resisting them, different neural processes begin activating. Reflection engages areas of the brain associated with regulation and integration. Naming emotions reduces their intensity. Self-awareness interrupts automatic reactivity. The nervous system begins shifting from unconscious survival toward conscious adaptation. This may explain why journaling, reflective practices, mindful breathing, and emotional awareness exercises show measurable psychological benefits in scientific studies. These practices help individuals move experiences from automatic reaction into conscious processing. Again, this is not about pretending pain does not exist. Consciousness research does not deny suffering. Instead, it explores how awareness influences the way suffering is carried within the human system. Two individuals may endure similar hardship, yet one becomes permanently trapped in bitterness while another develops wisdom, compassion, and inner strength. Scientists increasingly recognize that interpretation, emotional processing, and meaning-making strongly influence long-term outcomes. Meaning itself has become an important subject of research. Human beings appear biologically affected by purpose. Individuals who experience strong meaning in life often demonstrate greater resilience during stress, improved emotional regulation, and stronger long-term psychological health. Without meaning, the nervous system can drift toward hopelessness and emotional fragmentation. With meaning, even difficulty becomes easier to endure because the mind perceives direction beyond immediate discomfort. This may be why consciousness cannot be fully reduced to chemistry alone. Chemistry matters enormously, but human awareness also seeks significance, connection, and understanding. We are not simply machines processing data. We are meaning-making beings constantly interpreting existence through emotion and perception. Scientists studying peak performance frequently observe this principle as well. The highest performing individuals often enter states of deep focus, where self-conscious mental noise temporarily disappears. Athletes call it being in the zone. Artists describe creative flow. Researchers studying these states found unique patterns of brain synchronization associated with heightened performance, presence, and absorption. In these moments, consciousness appears highly coherent. Attention becomes unified. Internal conflict decreases. Action and awareness align smoothly together. Many individuals describe these experiences as deeply fulfilling because they create a sense of connection between mind, body, and purpose. What interests scientists is that such states are trainable to some degree. Through practice, attention regulation, and emotional conditioning, people may increase access to these highly focused states. Once again, awareness proves adaptable rather than fixed. Sleep research also adds another fascinating layer to the discussion. During sleep, the brain reorganizes memory, processes emotion, and restores neurological balance. Dream states continue puzzling researchers because consciousness persists in altered forms even while external awareness decreases. The mind generates symbolic narratives, emotional simulations, and creative associations that sometimes reveal insights unavailable during waking thought. This suggests consciousness operates on multiple levels simultaneously, many of which remain poorly understood. Some neuroscientists even propose that the brain may function less like a creator of consciousness and more like a receiver or filter, organizing conscious experience into physical reality. While theories remain debated, the fact that such ideas are now seriously discussed reveals how far consciousness research has expanded beyond older material assumptions. At its core, this fascination comes from one simple truth. Consciousness is the lens through which every human experience occurs. Every emotion, every memory, every fear, every dream, every relationship, and every perception of reality emerges through awareness itself. And the deeper scientists explore that mystery, the more humanity may begin realizing that understanding consciousness is not merely an intellectual pursuit reserved for laboratories or universities, but a deeply personal exploration capable of transforming how we relate to our thoughts, emotions, biology, relationships, habits, suffering, creativity, and ultimately the entire experience of being alive in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. As this understanding continues to evolve, scientists are also beginning to ask whether consciousness may influence collective human behavior in ways that extend beyond the individual. For a long time, emotions were viewed as private internal experiences isolated within each person. But modern research increasingly shows that emotional states spread through human interaction constantly. Stress transfers between people, calm transfers between people, fear, anger, compassion, and even optimism ripple through families, workplaces, communities, and entire societies. I find this deeply important because it means consciousness is not only personal, it is relational. Every conversation carries emotional energy that affects the nervous systems involved. Tone of voice changes heart rate and stress chemistry. Facial expressions influence emotional interpretation. Human beings continuously regulate one another biologically through social connection, often without conscious awareness. Scientists studying interpersonal neurobiology have observed that the brain and nervous system are profoundly shaped through relationships from the earliest stages of life. A child repeatedly exposed to safety, encouragement, and emotional presence develops differently from a child exposed to chronic fear or instability. Over time, these experiences shape perception, stress response, and emotional regulation patterns that may persist into adulthood. In this sense, consciousness develops within relationship long before we consciously understand ourselves. This realization changes the way we think about emotional responsibility. If our internal states affect not only ourselves but the people around us, then awareness becomes something far more meaningful than personal self-improvement. The quality of our presence influences others continuously. A calm nervous system can reduce anxiety in a room. Genuine compassion can shift emotional tension instantly. Even focused attention during conversation affects how safe another person feels psychologically. Scientists researching empathy discovered that humans possess neural systems allowing us to internally mirror aspects of other people's emotional states. This may explain why emotions spread so quickly in groups. We are biologically designed for connection. Isolation affects mental and physical health because the nervous system expects relational regulation as part of healthy functioning. At the same time, modern life often fragments attention and weakens genuine human connection. Many people spend more time interacting with screens than observing their own emotional condition or deeply listening to others. Constant stimulation overwhelms awareness. Information increases while inner clarity decreases. This may be one reason anxiety and emotional exhaustion continue rising globally despite technological advancement. Human beings have gained extraordinary external tools, yet many struggle to regulate their internal world. Consciousness research suggests that external progress alone cannot create psychological balance if awareness itself remains fragmented. I often think about how rarely people are taught to understand their own minds. We learn mathematics, language, and technical skills, but few receive deep education about emotional regulation, attention, self-awareness, or nervous system balance. As a result, many individuals spend decades reacting unconsciously to patterns they never learned to observe clearly. But scientists are increasingly recognizing that awareness itself can be trained. Attention functions much like a muscle. What we repeatedly focus on becomes stronger neurologically. Constant distraction weakens sustained concentration. Repeated emotional rumination strengthens stress pathways. Intentional focus strengthens clarity and regulation. The brain adapts according to repeated mental experience. This insight carries profound implications for daily life. If a person constantly consumes fear-driven information, the nervous system gradually conditions itself toward vigilance and emotional tension. If someone repeatedly practices gratitude, reflection, and emotional presence, entirely different patterns strengthen over time. The mind and body continuously learn from repeated experience whether we realize it or not. Even memory appears influenced by emotional state. Research shows that strong emotions prioritize certain memories within the brain, particularly those associated with survival. This is why painful experiences often feel more vivid than peaceful ones. The nervous system evolved to remember potential threats for protection. But in modern environments, this tendency can trap individuals inside cycles of overthinking and emotional anticipation. Conscious awareness interrupts this cycle by bringing attention back to the present moment rather than constantly replaying past pain or future fear. Scientists studying present moment awareness found that individuals practicing mindfulness often demonstrate reduced emotional reactivity and improved cognitive flexibility. Instead of becoming consumed by every thought or emotion, they gradually develop the ability to witness experience with greater stability. That stability may be one of the most valuable forms of intelligence humans can cultivate, because without inner stability, external conditions control emotional life entirely. Every criticism becomes devastation. Every uncertainty becomes panic. Every setback becomes identity. But when awareness strengthens, people gain the ability to experience difficulty without becoming psychologically overwhelmed by it. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb. In fact, the opposite often occurs. As awareness deepens, people frequently become more emotionally sensitive, more compassionate, and more connected to life. But they also become less unconsciously reactive because they are no longer completely identified with every passing emotional state. Researchers examining long-term meditators sometimes observe increased activity in brain regions associated with empathy, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. These findings suggest that consciousness practices may not merely reduce stress, but actually enhance qualities related to human connection and psychological maturity. And perhaps this is what continues drawing scientists toward the mystery of consciousness, despite all its unanswered questions. Consciousness appears linked not only to cognition, but to identity, meaning, emotion, creativity, resilience, relationships, and the human capacity for transformation itself. The deeper researchers explore awareness, the more they uncover evidence that human beings are far more adaptive, interconnected, and internally influential than earlier models of the mind once assumed. And if that understanding continues expanding, humanity may eventually realize that one of the greatest frontiers of scientific discovery has never existed somewhere far away in space or hidden beneath the oceans, but within the silent, invisible, deeply powerful landscape of human consciousness that shapes every moment of our lives from the inside outward. And perhaps the most extraordinary part of this exploration is that consciousness does not seem limited to intellectual understanding alone. Scientists can study brain activity, monitor hormones, and observe neural pathways, but consciousness is also something every human being experiences directly every moment of every day. It is both deeply scientific and deeply personal at the same time. I think this is why this subject captivates so many researchers across completely different fields. Neuroscientists approach it through the brain. Psychologists study behavior and perception. Physicists question the nature of observation itself. Biologists examine the relationship between stress, emotion, and cellular activity. Yet despite their different methods, many arrive at the same realization: awareness influences reality in ways we still do not fully understand. One area gaining significant attention is the relationship between expectation and physical performance. Researchers repeatedly observe that what individuals believe about themselves strongly affects outcomes. People who perceive challenges as impossible often perform worse before they even begin. Meanwhile, those who cultivate confidence and emotional resilience activate entirely different physiological responses. This does not mean belief replaces effort or eliminates difficulty. Rather, belief changes the internal conditions under which effort occurs. When a person believes failure is inevitable, the nervous system enters defensive states associated with fear and contraction. Creativity narrows, focus weakens, motivation declines. But when someone experiences emotional certainty, purpose, or hope, the body organizes itself differently. Energy increases, attention sharpens, persistence improves. Consciousness shapes performance because perception shapes biology. I often reflect on how many limitations people carry simply because they repeated the same internal story for years. At some point, thoughts stop feeling like thoughts and start feeling like absolute truth. Someone says, "I'm not capable, I always fail," or "nothing ever changes," and the nervous system gradually conditions itself around those assumptions. Over time, identity forms around repeated emotional patterns. Scientists studying habit formation discovered that repeated thoughts and behaviors strengthen specific neural connections through a process often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together. In practical terms, the brain becomes efficient at repeating familiar states. The more often certain emotional pathways activate, the easier they become to trigger automatically. This explains why change initially feels uncomfortable for many people. The brain prefers familiarity, even when familiarity creates suffering. New emotional responses require conscious interruption of old conditioning, and that process demands attention, repetition, and patience. But encouragingly, the same adaptability that creates limiting patterns also allows transformation. Researchers studying resilience found that individuals who intentionally practice emotional regulation, reframing, and mindful awareness gradually strengthen psychological flexibility. They become better able to recover from stress and less trapped by automatic reactions. Consciousness, in this sense, becomes trainable. What fascinates scientists even more is how rapidly the body sometimes responds once perception changes. Individuals overcoming long-held fear patterns often report physical sensations shifting almost immediately. Breathing changes, muscle tension decreases, energy increases. It is as though the nervous system reorganizes itself when awareness no longer interprets reality through the same emotional filter. This relationship between interpretation and physiology may be one of the most important discoveries emerging from consciousness research. Human beings are not passive observers of life. We continuously shape our experience through attention and meaning. The events of life matter deeply, but the way consciousness processes those events matters as well. Consider stress as an example. Short-term stress can help the body adapt and respond effectively. But chronic psychological stress creates entirely different consequences. When the mind constantly anticipates danger, the nervous system behaves as though threat never ends. Over time, this continuous activation affects sleep, immunity, concentration, digestion, emotional balance, and overall health. Many researchers now describe chronic stress as one of the defining biological conditions of modern life. And yet, alongside this growing challenge, scientists are also uncovering remarkable evidence that intentional awareness practices can reduce stress physiology significantly. Meditation, breath work, focused relaxation, gratitude exercises, and emotional processing techniques all demonstrate measurable effects on the nervous system. What interests researchers is not merely relaxation itself, but the fact that conscious attention appears capable of influencing automatic biological systems once believed largely outside voluntary control. This raises a profound possibility. If awareness can influence stress responses, emotional conditioning, attention, and even neural structure, then consciousness may play a far more active role in human health and development than earlier scientific models recognized. I believe this understanding could eventually transform education, healthcare, leadership, and even the way society approaches mental well-being. Instead of treating human beings as disconnected systems of separate parts, consciousness research points toward integration. Mind and body continuously communicate. Emotions influence biology. Relationships shape nervous system regulation. Attention affects perception. Meaning affects resilience. Everything is connected within the human experience. At the same time, scientists remain cautious because consciousness still contains enormous mystery. Even the most advanced brain imaging technologies cannot fully explain subjective awareness itself. We can identify correlates of experience, but the essence of experience remains elusive. Why does music move us emotionally? Why does beauty affect the nervous system so deeply? Why can a memory instantly change body chemistry? Why does human awareness possess imagination capable of envisioning futures beyond present reality? These questions continue pushing scientific inquiry into deeper territory because consciousness appears to transcend simple mechanical explanation. And perhaps this is why the fascination continues growing worldwide. The study of consciousness is ultimately the study of ourselves. It explores how thought becomes emotion, how emotion becomes biology, how attention becomes identity, and how awareness itself may hold the power to reshape patterns once believed permanent, opening possibilities for human transformation that many people are only beginning to recognize within their own lives as they slowly awaken to the immense influence of the mind upon the body and the entire experience of being human.
What makes consciousness such a fascinating subject is that it touches every part of human life, yet most people rarely stop to examine it directly. We wake up each morning inside a stream of thoughts, emotions, memories, reactions, and perceptions, but we often assume this inner activity is simply who we are. Modern science is beginning to challenge that assumption in remarkable ways. Researchers studying the brain and nervous system are discovering that consciousness is not passive. The way we think, feel, focus, and interpret life appears to influence our biology continuously. In simple terms, the mind and body are constantly communicating with each other. Think about stress for a moment. Imagine someone receives a stressful email at work. Their heart rate increases, their muscles tighten, their breathing becomes shallow, stress hormones flood the body, yet nothing physically dangerous is happening in the room itself. The body is reacting to interpretation. This alone reveals something profound. The human nervous system responds not only to reality, but to our perception of reality. This is one reason scientists are so fascinated by consciousness. Perception shapes experience far more deeply than we once believed. The brain works a bit like a prediction machine. It constantly scans the environment, compares present experiences to past memories, and creates emotional responses based on what it expects will happen next. If someone has spent years living in fear, disappointment, or emotional instability, the brain becomes conditioned to anticipate those experiences automatically. Over time, this conditioning becomes so familiar that people stop noticing it. Anxiety feels normal. Overthinking feels normal. Emotional tension feels normal. The body memorizes stress through repetition, but here is where the science becomes empowering. The brain is adaptable. Researchers call this neuroplasticity, which simply means the brain can reorganize itself based on repeated experiences, thoughts, and behaviors. The more often we repeat a mental or emotional pattern, the stronger the associated neural pathways become. In other words, whatever we repeatedly practice internally becomes easier for the brain to continue repeating. Imagine walking through a grassy field. The first time you walk across it, the path is barely visible. But if you walk the same route every day, eventually a clear trail forms. Thoughts and emotions work similarly inside the brain. Repeated fear creates a strong pathway for fear. Repeated gratitude strengthens pathways associated with calm and emotional balance. This explains why changing our lives can feel difficult at first. The brain prefers familiarity, even if that familiarity creates suffering. Someone who has spent years expecting rejection may unconsciously interpret neutral situations negatively because the brain has become trained to anticipate pain. This is why awareness matters so much. The moment we begin observing our thoughts instead of automatically believing every thought, we create space for change. Awareness interrupts unconscious patterns. Scientists studying mindfulness have found that conscious attention can reduce emotional reactivity and strengthen areas of the brain associated with emotional regulation and self awareness. Think of awareness like turning on a light in a dark room. The room already existed, but now you can finally see what is inside it clearly. One of the most practical things people can do daily is simply pause and observe their inner state without judgment. Ask yourself questions like, what emotion am I rehearsing most often? What thoughts dominate my attention? Is my body living in calm or constant tension? These questions build self awareness, and self awareness is where transformation begins. Breathing is another powerful example of the connection between consciousness and biology. Most people breathe automatically and rarely pay attention to it, but scientists discovered that slow, intentional breathing directly affects the nervous system. Deep, controlled breaths can reduce stress responses, lower heart rate, and signal safety to the body. A simple daily practice is this: spend 5 minutes breathing slowly and intentionally. Inhale gently through the nose, hold briefly, then exhale slowly. As simple as this sounds, it teaches the nervous system that it does not need to remain trapped in survival mode constantly. Another important insight from consciousness research involves emotional energy. Emotions are not just abstract feelings floating through the mind, they create measurable physiological changes throughout the body. Chronic anger, fear, and resentment keep the nervous system activated. Compassion, gratitude, and emotional connection create entirely different biological conditions. This does not mean people should suppress negative emotions or pretend everything is positive. Real growth comes from acknowledging emotions honestly, rather than avoiding them. Suppressed emotions often continue influencing the body unconsciously. Awareness allows emotions to move through us instead of controlling us from beneath the surface. One helpful daily practice is emotional labeling. When strong emotions arise, pause and name them clearly. I am feeling anxious, or I am feeling frustrated. Research shows that identifying emotions reduces their intensity because it activates reflective areas of the brain rather than purely reactive survival responses. Consciousness research also teaches us something deeply important about attention. Whatever consistently receives our attention begins shaping our inner world. If we constantly consume fear, outrage, negativity, and comparison, the nervous system absorbs those emotional signals repeatedly. But if we intentionally focus on learning, gratitude, meaningful connection, and calm reflection, the brain gradually strengthens those patterns. Instead, attention is like water feeding a garden. Whatever we water grows. This is why practices such as journaling, meditation, quiet reflection, time in nature, and intentional gratitude can have such powerful long term effects. These activities train awareness rather than leaving it controlled entirely by external stimulation. Perhaps the deepest insight emerging from consciousness research is this: we are not permanently trapped by old conditioning. Human beings are adaptable. The brain changes, emotional patterns can evolve, perception can shift. Awareness allows us to become active participants in our own transformation rather than passive prisoners of unconscious habits. And maybe this is why scientists continue exploring consciousness with such fascination. Beneath all the research, brain scans, and biological studies lies a simple but life changing realization. The quality of our awareness shapes the quality of our experience. And the moment we begin consciously working with our thoughts, emotions, attention, and inner state, we begin changing not only how we feel, but how we live our entire lives from the inside out.